Well, thank you very much for joining us for another ICMI open forum discussion. We've got Natalie, my co-host in the Australian League today, myself, and we're actually expecting a guest presenter as well. So it's been a little bit delayed, but hopefully it can join us in the near future. Natalie, you had something that you wanted to discuss.
I did. Now, the presenter before this, George Christensen, MP, just had a quick look him up because I'm blonde and I didn't know who he was. And he's the Liberal National Party of Queensland, I believe around Mackay.
So for those who don't, because we've got an international audience, George Christensen, who just gave the presentation before this one, is he's a federal MP, he's a member of Parliament, but he's in the state of Queensland, state I happen to live in. Natalie's in Victoria, and as a general rule, nobody has any idea about the MPs from other states. So I'm not at all surprised you didn't know anything about George Christensen. I
don't even know the MPs from my states. Are you kidding? They're all okay. Anyway, so he actually brought up a really good point when it comes to abortion. So even though he is pro-life, that wasn't his argument. His argument was, when it comes to abortion, men have no jurisdiction. Like, they have no choice. It's all up to the woman.
Yeah. Before you go on, Natalie, welcome, Douglas. How are you today? Looks like you're muted at the moment. Sorry, Natalie.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Oh, good, no worries. So, Douglas, you had the Q&A in the last session. Do you want to just really quickly introduce yourself for this session?
Yeah. Been an activist and advocate for, I don't know, almost 20 years. Mostly at the international level, but otherwise in my home country of UK, right away from national down to literally local village level.
Fabulous, and thank you very much for joining us as a guest panelist on this open forum discussion. Natalie thought we'd start with something light today, so we've started with abortion, because obviously that's
very light.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, he did mention the fact that if a woman chooses that she doesn't want to have the child, she's got every legal right to abort the child. He wasn't discussing an opinion on abortion, he was just pointing out that fact. But he did state, and I love this argument, he did state that if a woman chooses to go through with the pregnancy, a male still has no choice. He is still legally bound to financially support that child. Now, it's been a long time, so I forget, but I do know that somewhere in Europe, there is one country that has legalized paper abortion. So for those that don't know what a paper abortion is, a father signing away all rights to the child within the same time frame as the mother of being able to get a physical abortion. Saying that, he did tell a story after it about a man who had a one-night stand with a woman, and then over a decade later got a letter in the mail about wanting DNA tests. I won't go into the other part of the story, I just wanted to point this part out. Turns out he was the father, and now he's has to pay for child support.
Yes.
So when I say a paper abortion, so when a woman falls pregnant, she basically knows before the child's born. 99.99999% she knows before the child's born. When I say the same time frame, so if it's a woman can have an abortion within the first trimester, the first 3 months, then a man, after finding out that there's a child or a child on the way, he has 3 months to do a paper abortion, even if it's 10 years down the track, because he didn't know.
Based on when.
Yeah.
Based on when he was notified.
For the feminists that want to say, you know, you should have covered it up, you know, you should have put glide wrap on that sucker or whatever they want to use. She also had control of her birth control. So if she accidentally fell pregnant, where she decides to have an abortion, you can't continuously blame the guy. Like, there's women have countless amounts of birth control. Men have one.
Yeah. So that's called, so yeah, as you say, it's sometimes called paper abortion or legal abortion. Another term is legal parental surrender. And it's a position that the men's rights movement is generally advocating. There's some, like, for example, Justice for Men and Boys is come up much more strongly in an anti-abortion position. Not all men's rights groups are doing that. But aside from that, if abortion does exist, we insist that men get the same opportunity to have essentially legal release from that.
That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying either one is morally correct or not correct, but if it's legal for one, it's got to be legal for the other.
Yeah, and Douglas, this is just a roundtable open discussion format, so feel free to jump in with a topic or a comment on the topic we're talking about, or whatever it happens to be. So, as I said, we started with something, started with abortion, which is a big topic, and Mike is advocating for that to be a topic that we talk more about actually in the future, and I think that probably makes sense beyond just talking about legal parental surrender. Another topic I want to talk about on one of the open forums, not necessarily today, is definitely male genital mutilation, because after we saw in the first day some of the discussions we had on the very early screenings with some of the speakers were a bit shocked that we were so vehemently anti-MGM. I think it'd be interesting to have a chat on that down the road as well. But there's all sorts of topics that we can talk about. Feminism, for example, is a big one, where it was huge. We're in Douglas's talk, he was talking about cultural Marxism and so forth, and really the origins of where feminism is getting a lot of that information from, and how it's propagating. But I don't know. Has anyone got any suggestions, or do we have any? Don't have any questions at the moment.
I think one thing to notice here, and that we've all got to be aware of in the men's movement, is we don't have to agree on everything. We don't have to agree that MGM is bad. We don't have to agree on abortion. We don't have to agree on any of these issues, specific issues. That is not what the men's movement needs to be about, is about. It's about general push for men's rights and men's dignity.
Yeah, that is true.
So if you find yourself on the minority in disagreeing with one particular aspect, that's fine. And I hope you manage to get a voice for your issues and the way you believe.
We have a long tradition of being tolerant of alternative viewpoints too, and that's one of the many things that distinguishes us from feminism. I mentioned, I think, on an open, you may have been an attendee in that one, Douglas. I mentioned that at ICMIs we routinely have feminists at the events. There are very, very few cases of anyone involved, whether they call themselves MRAs or not, of men's advocates being allowed in feminist events at all. I know of only one case where that was really the case, and they were allowed in, a few of them, and they weren't allowed to speak for most of it. I think they were allowed to put up their hand and ask a question or something at one point question, but it was very, very heavily regulated. And I think they actually ended up booting them out in the end anyway. And you compare that to how we're open, we're happy to have our opponents come in as long as they're not disruptive. There are, as you say, disagreements within our own movement. So, for example, Justice for Men and Boys is very clearly an anti-abortion organisation. My own organisation, the Australian Men's Rights Association, has really essentially taken no specific position on abortion beyond the fact that that legal parental surrender is absolutely essential. So, and I take Mike's point and the point of others that maybe that's something we should look at. But genital mutilation is something I think we're seeing more agreement on. Maybe when I first got involved about 10 years ago, I think there was more disagreement on that. That's my feeling. And there were sort of there was a minority at least who were saying we shouldn't get circumcision, it shouldn't involve it. But I would say at this point, most people who are really active in the community are on board with MGM being banned.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'd like to talk about the fact that the men's movement is something where there is a space for people who disagree on individual items is because I have met people who've said things like, oh no, I'm not involved in the men's rights movement because it doesn't support X, Y, Z, and, you know, or it thinks this. And that is completely wrong. We don't want to be turning away these people just because they don't agree like we do. And we need to be always allowing for the fact that, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, we're just a small group anyway, you know, and yeah, if they want to feel differently about male genital mutilation, they're welcome. You know, and we've got to especially be willing to, you know, to talk and be open. As you say, we are, and we've got to make that very clear to people. I know, for example, as what would you call him, a fundamentalist Muslim amongst our group at the moment. And, you know, he presumably is not going to be going along with the male genital mutilation line, and that's fine. And I welcome the chance to listen to him and to talk to him.
Yeah, he's, as you say, he's no doubt going to find that very challenging, to that aspect of it. Absolutely. My feeling is that to a large degree we have been quite inclusive and not rejecting people, but I've often met people too say, oh, MRAs believe this, MRAs believe that. And well, actually, not necessarily. And there's a lot of opportunity there for differing opinions, like we're saying. And sometimes it feels like people don't really take the time to look or talk to us. They just assume or believe what the media says about us.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, the media's got very little good to say about the men's rights movement, and it's one reason why, when I'm talking to the media, I must admit I tend to dodge the issue, and maybe it's a bit cowardly, but I hope to get any issues into the media, and I just call myself a human rights activist.
Yeah.
You know, which obviously, as a men's rights activist, I am.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't see any, while it may be sort of seen as cowardly by some, I think it's also a matter of, it's a matter of accurately portraying myself as well.
Well, I openly call myself a men's rights activist, but I've always said I'm an egalitarian as well. And I was egalitarian before, and I always will be. Yes, they're not necessarily, they're certainly not mutually exclusive. In fact, Paul Elam and Peter Wright proposed the term men's human rights activist, and it is used to some extent interchangeably with MRA. Of course, MRA will be used by the media in a negative light, but that's right. Men's rights are human rights. Actually, is another line that has come out of A Voice for Men. So I think so. They are human rights, and it is really interesting how we see that even from the media. Continue to see that line pushed. Here in Australia, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is the equivalent of the BBC and government funded a little bit differently. We don't have a TV tax, but it's funded out of government general revenue, and it's just extraordinary how biased it is, even though it's run by the government.
Yeah.
Yeah, but who runs the government?
Well, this is right.
The civil service.
Very good.
Well, no, honestly,
yeah.
I mean, you know, that is who runs it, and that's you know, that's something that was spotted by the Frankfurt School, going back to them, you know, and it's documented, and that's what they talk about. You know, you don't have to deal with the politicians, you have to deal with the civil servants, and if you can change what the civil servants think and believe, that's enough.
Which they have to a large degree done. I mean, feminism is, I think, in both countries and many other countries, the civil service, or as we call it, the public service, would be would be it's a hotbed of feminism. And I know actually MRAs who work in there, both male and female, and they have to be very, very careful. One woman did actually wear a men's rights Brisbane T-shirt into her office in the government, which I think, which I thought was very brave. I was very impressed by that.
Yeah, very good. I don't think a man could get away with it.
No, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. It was hard enough for her to do it, actually. But yes, it's interesting. Well, I think hearing some stories coming out of the state government there, or the government. So yes, so just looking at a few different issues here. So this is an interesting one to consider. I don't know if you've got many thoughts on this, or what sort of what you have on this, Douglas. But what do you think of MGTOW?
Well, interestingly enough, my opinion of MGTOW has been changing throughout this particular conference. I wouldn't say it's not been changing before that, but I used to think badly of MGTOW. Simply on the basis that I used to see it as a withdrawal from society, and I coupled that with effectively a surrender. You know, but I'm beginning to be convinced that you can be both a MGTOW and an activist, and
I think so.
To the extent that MGTOW, as I used to understand it, is a withdrawal and a giving up and not bothering to fight, I think MGTOW's bad. But MGTOW certainly makes sense for a great many men. And I think the other problem, of course, is that MGTOW, it plows directly into exactly what the cultural Marxists want, which is to help break apart society.
Yes, that is true. I've wrestled with that aspect of it myself too. Yeah, so there are people who would call themselves both MGTOW and men's rights activists. In fact, interestingly enough, some men who I've known for years, I mean, I've heard feminists sometimes criticize MGTOW, and they're saying, well, if you're going your own way, why are you always on Facebook talking about, you know, this, and, you know, but in reality, I found there are many, many MGTOW who don't actually advertise it. There've been a few cases where I've known them for years before I found out that they considered themselves doing MGTOW. So there certainly is an aspect where you can be a MGTOW and separate yourself from society or step back, but still engage in activism. Absolutely. I also, so I was going to go to your point about how it sort of, to a certain extent, does play into their hands, unfortunately. But I do like the idea that MGTOW could be an economic weapon collectively, where if enough, I mean, men essentially keep particularly young men, keep the entire system functioning in terms of their taxation. It's the surplus produced by young men that essentially keeps the entire system functioning. And there's a major study out of New Zealand that did a really good job of looking at that. So there's that, but I have wrestled with this idea that you're talking about, where they are stepping back and therefore are playing into exactly where the cultural Marxists wanted. And I personally haven't kind of come to a resolution on that as to how we can reconcile those two aspects of it, if we can.
No, indeed, it's kind of difficult, isn't it? Because it's very understandable that the reaction to what they're doing is what they're doing, but at the same time, it's yeah, it is very difficult.
Yeah.
But in terms of impact, the Japanese version of MGTOW, I think, is very definitely having an impact, and that is something that is in the public discourse as well.
That's right. And you were talking about herbivore men then, or grass-eating men, as they're called.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
The
grass eaters don't even particularly have to be yelling about anything, and they are being noticed. You know, people have noticed, hang on, all these people are just withdrawing from active society. This is not good.
I've heard that they've been mentioned in the Diet, the Japanese Parliament, actually, which is something that, you know, neither MGTOW nor the men's rights movement has managed to do, as far as I know, be actually mentioned in any parliament. So yeah, as far as I know, there are huge numbers in Japan of herbivore men, as I tend to call them, and they must be having a huge economic impact and demographic impact as well.
Yes, yeah, and of course that's something that again, you know, thinking about Russia is something that is a good potential in Russia, because already there is a large number of men in Russia that are giving up, and Russia has a specific problem in the fact that it has a huge disproportion in the current generation of people between the numbers of men and number of women. There are a lot more women in Russia than there are men, and so
no, go on. Yeah.
And so the situation in Russia is already quite bad for women, yet alone now, you know, you've got quite a lot of men that are just withdrawing and saying, why should I bother? You know, look at the way that we're being treated and talked at. No, you know, I'm not going to bother, thanks very much. Which, of course, is making the situation even worse for women there.
Yep. So, so it's interesting now. So the number of, after World War II, it was the Soviets would call it the Great Patriotic War. There was a terrible gender disparity in the Soviet Union. I think something like 10% of the male population had been killed. A considerable number of women were killed as well, but they were left with a considerable demographic gap in gender. I actually didn't realize that they still had such a serious problem in terms of the gender disparity now. But as you say, if you've got MGTOW taking off there, or something like it taking off there, that's going to have a huge impact. And they're already having trouble maintaining their population numbers. Russian population declined for about 20 years in population.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an issue in Russia. And of course, while people don't necessarily care about what's happening to men, they certainly do care about when it's happening to women. Exactly. And you know, when women start saying, hang on, I can't find a decent husband, then yeah, people are starting to take notice.
So one problem we have, I find, is maintaining connections to non-English or essentially different language groups. We have fairly good connections to the men's rights movement in Germany. I was able to talk to many of the prominent members in that community when I was at ICMI 16 in London, for example. But there are other communities. We've got some connections in the Spanish-speaking world, which is good. They've actually improved in recent years. But there are other areas like Japan, which is a problem, and Russia. I can't think of anybody involved in either MGTOW or men's rights in Russia that I know of. So that's something if we could get better connections there. I don't know if you know of anybody, Douglas, but if we get better connections there, it would be absolutely fantastic.
I have one Russian connection, but she's living in Ireland.
Okay. Well, she speaks the right language though, so you could still talk to people back home. Yeah. So perhaps that's something we can think about. I know we've got a few things we're going to chat about after the conference is over. So that's something I would really like, especially I wasn't aware that MGTOW was really growing there actually. So if that's the case, it'd be something really interesting to look at, maybe get a few people from there interviewed, even perhaps in English if they can. That'd be great.
I don't know if it's MGTOW that's growing there so much as grass eaters.
Oh, I see. You think it's more of an equivalent of the grass eaters. Yeah, which is a somewhat different movement to MGTOW, exactly. It's more organic, more grassroots, as I understand it. Yeah. In fact, that is interesting. Actually, that's right. So I was going to sometimes people are interested in the difference between MGTOW and men's rights, and I've even known a few people who had come into our community who were a little surprised to discover, for example, that I'm married, or that Paul Elam has a long-time female partner. So, and people are quite shocked about this because they sometimes mistake MGTOW for men's rights. And I like to say that most MGTOW, not all, a lot will tell you not to get married. Men's rights, or MRAs, I think would suggest that to go in with your eyes open, to understand the legal ramifications of what you're doing. And I think that really speaks to the individualist strand in men's rights as well, where you're saying, we're not telling you not to get married, but understand what you're doing. There are ramifications for these actions, and understand what you're getting yourself into. I would suggest that's the distinction anyway. At least one.
Yeah. So I'm just looking up at a book here, you know, The Marriage Delusion from Mike Buchanan, The Fraud of the Rings. Because there are some parts that will tell you now marriage is absolutely stupid.
Yeah, yeah.
And
fair point. Yeah.
But that's part that brings me, if I can seek from there, it takes us to a different aspect of the men's movement that I've been thinking about for many years. I don't say thinking about it, I actually used to do something about it. But part of the problem, certainly with the public perception of the men's rights movement, is that we inevitably attract people who are just in the middle of a sudden divorce or suddenly discovering, you know, after separation they can't get their children and all of these sort of things. And of course, there's dozens of them every blooming hour that are coming into this situation, and they're looking for solutions and they're looking for help, and inevitably, you know, we attract such people, and so these people are still in that stage where they're very angry. They're going through, you know, they're just at the beginning of their 5 stages of anger, and they're screaming out because at that stage, you know, it's obviously not rational, but it's, you know, it's common to both men and women. You know, you fall out of a relationship, you get dealt with badly by your partner, and you blame all of the sex of the, you know, so a man gets hurt by his woman and he blames all women, and a woman gets hurt by a man and blames all men. And hopefully, of course, they get out of that after a time. And most people do get over that after a time and start to get a bit more rational about things and realize, no, you know, it's not all men, it's not all women. But of course, in that short period, while they're sorting themselves out, they are amongst the men's rights groups, they're on the forums, and they're coming out with all this vitriol. Yeah.
I've often said that one of the, and I said this actually during a comment in one of the early presentations at the conference, we tend to, feminism has allowed extremists to percolate to the top and rise into leadership roles. We tend to push people a bit more extreme to the side. And you're absolutely right, there are those people in our community. It's been my experience a fairly sizable number will come in, misunderstand what it is we're doing, and when they realize they want to be somewhere else and move on. And as you say, some people will just get over it. One thing that's come to my conclusion, the opinion I've come to over the years, and it's probably not a very popular opinion, but I'm afraid when people like that, I don't find they make very good activists, unfortunately. They may, as you say, get over it and become good activists, but unfortunately, people who are really so angry a lot of the time, I've found they're not really certainly probably not putting them in front of the media, but they're often not able to focus a lot. They've got a lot going on in their life, a lot of problems that just had to break up and fighting for kids and so forth. And often they're not the ones who are able to sort of really push things forward. That's been my experience. And yes, I mean, speaking from my position, I never, like virtually everybody in men's rights had some sort of issue that happened. My entry to that was quite different. I knew about other problems from when I was quite young. I remember talking about things like foreskins are being used in facial creams when I was 14, for example, which is decades ago now. And I did see some of the problems that men see, but I never had. I wasn't divorce raped. I wasn't subject to parental alienation and so forth. My entry to men's rights was quite unusual compared to a lot of people. What I saw instead was something that I was afraid was going to destroy civilization unless we do something about it, which is a position I continue to hold. So I guess in that regard, my position was my entry was a little bit different. Most people had some sort of pain point before they came in. But it's been my opinion for a while that really people who are going through that early stage probably aren't the best people to be involved. But when they start to calm down, they sort of get a bit rational again. And I think that's when we start to see people really getting stuck in a little bit. And sometimes that fire can keep them going after that.
Yeah, I think You're dead right. While they're in that angry stage, I think not only are they not a good public front for the men's rights movement, but to be honest, I don't think it's good for them to get involved. I don't think, that is not what it's about. And that is exactly what feminists do. They will, and that's of course why they run all these shelters and the advantage for them, because they will take a hurt woman. They will take a woman that's been, you know, in that woman's eyes at least, you know, has been harmed by a man, and probably has been. And they won't try and calm that woman down and take her gently through the 4 or 5 stages of anger. They will instead, you know, when she says, "Oh, men are shits," they're likely to say, "Yes, you're right." You know, and just reinforce and further, as far as I'm concerned, they're just further abusing the woman. Because they're not going to help that woman, you know, go through to a healthy stage of life. They're going to keep her there, and they're going to throw her into the political arena at that stage. You know, and they will take her straight onto a march, literally. I mean,
we've seen it so many times, haven't we?
You know, they'll take them straight out of the domestic violence shelter onto a feminist march.
Yep, you're absolutely right, and we see that all the time. Actually, there's probably. I mean, I was thinking of one particular example from Australia, but that is, you're right. That is absolutely something they will do. They'll put them in front of the media, and they'll get that, and they'll bear that pain in public. I was just going to say, Martin made a comment before. I'm sorry, Martin. I actually had the part of my window exposed, covered, that would have told me there was a chat message. So I'm sorry, I didn't notice your message earlier. It's regarding the discussion we were having before, where we talked about herbivore men in Japan, and Martin's making the point that in Japan it's not only men, there are also dry fish women. So he's making the point that as well as the men stepping back, you also have women stepping back, and of course Japan does already have a serious demographic issue. So thank you, Martin. It's a very good point.
Yeah, didn't know about dry fish women.
So we've so it's transpired. I've known Vernon for a while. Vernon's one of the and no, neither did I didn't know that term actually. So Vernon is one of the organisers in the US leg, and I've known Vernon for a while. And I only talking to him a few days ago, did I find out that Vernon actually grew up in Japan. So one of the things we're going to do after the conference is Vernon's going to be looking at some more Japanese language sources and get us some more hard information, because that language barrier has been a problem for us actually. So I don't know, Martin, if you have any sort of, if you're fluent in Japanese or if you had any sort of contacts there, but it'd be interesting to talk to you if that's the case. Because it is something I think as I said, I really want us to connect with other language groups, and Japan and also Russia, I think would be great ones to do.
No, it's one of, given the fact that I'm interested in international scene, I'm actually fairly crippled by only knowing English. Yet, you know, of course, a lot of, you know, English is the most commonly spoken language in the world, fortunately. And one of the things I'm managing to do is I'm attracting people just simply by being willing to converse in English, so that if they're actually learning English, you know, I can be out there on language forums who are trying, from these people who are trying to learn English, and get contacts that way. Like one of my most recent ones is in Kazakhstan. And whilst his English is pretty poor, I'm still finding him difficult to understand. He's also finding a common person, you know, in me on men's issues. So that's great. You know.
That's really good, actually. Yeah, that's right. Especially if you're able to make connections in various other countries as well. I love that idea. Actually, I hadn't thought of that before.
Yeah.
So speaking of international issues, especially with having you here, Douglas, and I know that's obviously your speech was about that, and an area of great interest to you. I alluded earlier to a Haitian diplomat who got the UN. He made a short statement about men's and boys issues, and I just wanted to clarify. I just brought up the article I wrote on it before. It was the United Nations Human Rights Council that actually, and I can provide you the exact session of the council. July 44th session, July 2020. And yeah, they actually managed to make a small statement about men's and boys' issues. The country of Haiti did. And I think some of the feminists in the room had steam blowing out of their ears at the time.
There are some people in the United Nations who are men's rights advocates. I wouldn't say activists, but they are men's rights advocates. And there are even more who are family advocates, which is, of course, closely allied to us and what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Certainly that's how I see them. And there are some groups also that are people that are also concerned about other areas, such as free speech and the decline of religion.
Yeah.
One of their contacts in the United Nations is very interesting, actually. He describes himself as an ex-Christian who's now a Hindu, which I've never heard of before. But, and he's promoting, it doesn't matter what religion, it just doesn't matter what faith, but they are all actually useful to society. And I think he's probably right. Personally, I'm an atheist. I used to be agnostic. I've been moved gradually to becoming an atheist. And I do see, even as an atheist, I do see the advantage to a society of religion. It gives it a structure, it gives you some ethics and morals. And you don't have to adapt all of them, I don't think. When it gets too fundamentalist, I think maybe, you know, it's veering on the unhelpful side, but it's certainly, even there, for those people who find it difficult to think about these things, better they have an external viewpoint given to them. These are your ethics and morals. This is what they should be.
A moral structure.
Yeah, because it's certainly better to have some than none.
Yeah, so that's actually a similar position. I'm also an atheist, but I believe that humanity is religion is one of the things that makes us human. As far as I know, religion has not been found in any other species. I think superstition has been found, but religion has never been found in another species. So I mean, there are lots of things they used to say that only humans did, and one by one they fell, tool making and all sorts of things like that. And storage of food for the winter, whatever it happened to be. But religion, as far as I know, is something to me is something that seems to be peculiarly human. So yes, I think and that's a good point about providing that external structure for anyone who feels they need that. So. That's one thing I was going to mention before we move on, actually. So you mentioned this Christian gentleman who'd become Hindu. So one of our speakers here, actually, Yoav Levine, he's Israeli, Jewish background, but I believe he's a Buddhist these days. So I think So in the modern world, and hopefully in a religiously tolerant society, people can find, you know, new paths that work for them. So
I assumed he was a Jew.
What was that, sorry?
I just assumed he was Jewish.
Yes, well, yes, certainly Jewish background. So yeah, but no, he's definitely a Buddhist, and actually in his speech he does talk a little bit, touch a little bit on his Buddhist beliefs. So one topic that we could talk about, if anyone's interested, is paternity fraud. I don't think we've talked about that in any of the open sessions yet. So I'm thinking particularly here, France. I don't know, Douglas, do you want to jump in there, or do you want me to lead off on paternity fraud in France, for those who don't know what happens there?
No, I'll let you jump in on that one. I'm also interested in Natalie's take on it.
No worries. So in France, and France is not the only country where this occurs, but in France, it's actually illegal to get a paternity test without a court order. And their specific statement is that the specific reason, they've stated the reason for this, is for family cohesion. So effectively, the French state has openly admitted that it will engage in paternity fraud in order to further the family, to keep, so basically the men are now bringing up children who aren't their own, and the state legally prohibits them from finding out. So Swiss and Swedish, Swiss and Spanish DNA testing companies, I believe, report an inordinately high number of French clients. So there are certainly tests doing it. There are tests going on illegally among French men, but they can't, because it's illegal and because the court is not ordering it, they can't present them in court. And there are other countries like that as well. I actually think Spain may also be doing that, but France is definitely doing it. And so you have the situation where French men cannot legally establish paternity, which is something that in Australia or the UK or wherever we just take for granted that if there was a concern that you could go ahead and do that.
Oh, you can't take that for granted in the UK.
Oh, really? Do tell.
A father is not allowed to get a paternity test without the mother's agreement.
I didn't know that. Really? I didn't know that. As far as I know, that's certainly not the case in Australia. As far as I know, a man could order say he was living with the child, he could order a paternity, he could order DNA test, take the DNA from the child's mouth, and then have the test sent off. Is that right? Thank you very much.
Yeah. So in this country, you do get that stupid situation like in France and quite a few other countries, I believe, where the man can end up getting being charged for child support and say, well, as far as I know, it's not my child. And the court will say, prove it. And he says, well, I need a DNA test. And he says, okay, turn to the mother. Do you agree with DNA test? No. And that's it. End of story. Court says, sorry, you can't prove it then, can you? You're the father.
Criminal. Absolutely criminal. And state-sanctioned criminality, really. It's absolutely awful. I mean, it's interesting. I guess I've heard more about the US and the problems they have over there. I didn't actually realize that you were having those problems in the UK as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, no, go on. You go on, Douglas.
So at the same time, the United Nations is pushing out the fact that there should be a it's pushing for a national database in each nation on DNA, so that rapists can be caught. But of course, in the middle of this, it's saying, but this is not data that should be available to anybody else. So you couldn't use it yourself to say, hang on, is this person my child?
Yeah. But the state can use it. So you're saying the state would have access to it, but they were prohibiting use for any other reason.
Yeah, they would only have access to it for the purpose of catching rapists.
Yeah. I wish I could say I was surprised. That's absolutely extraordinary. And that's coming from the UN. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Martin just has a comment here talking about paternity testing. Germany as well. Get the test and then destroy it. Then find a reason to contest. When you contest, can get a test. Okay, so basically, yeah, get a test done in secretly. Then you know the truth, and then you can. So that you're saying the German courts, if you can test, you can at least get a test done, which is sounds a little better than the situation in France or UK, but it shows the problem that men are experiencing all around the world. And as you said yourself, Douglas, it varies. It's a little bit different in each country, and there are some problems that are worse in some, and some are worse in others.
Yeah, Sean's got a question in, and yeah.
Yeah, as I've said, like I've talked about Canada and Australia where I've lived, Melbourne and Toronto. I talked about two being very bad cities, at least in terms of misandry and so forth, which I often see as a core issue at the root of a lot of the problems we see, where it's been very overt. We had feminists calling for a curfew for men in Australia about 3 or 4 years ago, and you did have that in the UK as well. More recently, we saw, but we had this about 3 or 4 years ago after a woman was murdered and raped in a park. And it was an awful murder and rape, obviously, but the feminists picked up on it and really ran with it. But I have to say, I've noticed something interesting they're not doing that as much in the last 2 or 3 years. I've sensed a change, at least among Australian feminists. And there've been, obviously, as there are, unfortunately, occasionally murders and so forth. And if a woman is murdered, they're not launching themselves into a protest. Even accounting for COVID-19, I think that there's been a change in their approach, which is interesting. And I think there may be some reasons behind that, but it's something I'm observing at the moment.
Yeah, not spotted that one.
No. So that's more a peculiarly Australian thing I've noticed, that they seem to be taking 5-6 years ago, we would have, if there was a woman murdered and raped in a park, you would have seen the next day thousands of women marching down the streets of Melbourne. And then about 2 or 3 years ago, before COVID-19, that started to end. So I'm not, I think there's a few reasons for that. This is something but I don't know if you have anyone seeing that in other countries, but that is.
What about the murders of Indigenous people?
What was that, sorry?
What about murders of Indigenous people?
Yeah, sorry, what about murders of Indigenous people in Australia?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so the Indigenous community has a lot of problems here. I just noticed, actually, Sean's popped some questions in. I'll be getting to those in just a moment, actually. There are the problems with the Indigenous people in Australia do have very, very serious problems. The domestic violence rate is something like 30 times the national average, and it's so high that it actually distorts the national number, even though they're only 2 to 3% of the population. So there's sexual assault rates are absolutely atrocious, many, many times the state rate, the national rate. There was a judge in the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory is a part of Australia where a high proportion of the population are Aboriginal. It's a very rural area. In fact, most of you would call the outback, right? So an elderly Aboriginal man who's about 60, this is going back about 10 or 15 years, sexually assaulted a young girl about 9 or 10 or something like that. And the judge gave this man, the male judge, gave this man a reduced sentence because sexual assault was more acceptable in Aboriginal communities, was his argument. And so he didn't give the same punishment that he would have given to a non-Indigenous Australian. And there was public outrage over this. And I think that they walked it back a little bit after that. The man was subsequently resentenced, and they did walk that back a little bit. But they, in terms of after that, they were a little bit more careful with the sentencing in that manner. But this goes to show that there is a recognition that they have very, very serious problems. Now, we hear a lot about domestic violence and intimate partner violence against Aboriginal women. There's almost no discussion of violence against intimate partner violence against Aboriginal men. We can pretty much assume that it's happening on the same rates as you would see anywhere else. Very, very serious problems. They've had fuel sniffing or gasoline or gas sniffing is such a problem in Indigenous communities in Australia that all the oil companies in Australia, at the encouragement of the government, have started producing a special fuel which goes into Aboriginal communities and can't get you high. And it's more expensive for the fuel companies to produce that fuel, and the government subsidises the extra cost. But they actually provide that into predominantly Aboriginal communities just because of the seriousness of those issues. But what's happened in the last couple of years and really concerns me, and it's probably a little bit off topic for the conference, but it does come back because it comes back to identity politics. In the last 2 or 3 years, since the rise of Black Lives Matter, there's been a parallel Black Lives Matter movement in Australia concerning Aborigines, and they're principally talking about one issue, and that's Aboriginal deaths in custody. But the thing is, the Aboriginal deaths in custody rate, which was very high in the past, has met the national average as of about 2 or 3, 4, 5 years, actually maybe even a little more, a number of years ago. So it was a serious issue in the past, and there was a Royal Commission, and they addressed it, and the rate gradually dropped until it met the national average. So in the last 2 years, we've had people marching in the streets talking about Aboriginal deaths in custody, even though this is an issue that has now essentially been solved, because and the Australian Bureau of Statistics data clearly shows this to be the case. But what's interesting is people stop talking about domestic violence and sexual assault in Aboriginal communities. It's got me really concerned that what people would have been looking at, maybe not doing much about, but addressing a few years ago, it's all gone off the radar now. So that's probably a bit of a segue, but I think it does come back because we're talking about identity politics there.
Well, that's why I asked, because when I think about it, could also say, like with Brazil and the USA, there's been a lot of stuff about minority race deaths, but I don't know as to whether it's so true about the lack of interest in women's death, or apparent lack of interest in women's deaths. But there certainly has been an increase in minority racial deaths, and maybe that's where things have been switched to. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. So I will. Sean's actually posted a few comments. I do apologise being late getting to your questions there, Sean. So he's actually made 3 comments. So I'll read all 3 comments. Is COVID a distinct issue for men, given that men already suffer more from chronic disease in general? Isn't it just more of the same old? Yes, I think that's and he's commented further, chronic disease and preventable early death. That's right. And I think maybe let's talk about that first. Douglas, do you want to speak to that? COVID-19 and men.
Yeah. William Collins, the excellent researcher in the UK, has been tracking the COVID stuff quite a lot. And I think he started from a position of, like many of us, thinking and just assuming that the government were doing what had to be done, in a dire situation. But at the same time, he's very smart at looking into the facts and looking for facts. And I think what really alerted to him was the fact that there weren't many facts that he could find initially. And he's got several reports about COVID on his website. It's empathygap.uk. And yes, it is pretty much same old, I think. Slightly exacerbated in terms of COVID, because not only have the high number of deaths of men been ignored to a large extent, but there's been calls out to men to give blood where necessary for certain trials, because men are more likely to have had a bad experience with COVID than women. So yes, on the one hand, it's been ignored, but on the other hand, it's been acknowledged so long as men can be useful.
Yes. I'm going to jump in and mention Sean's last question, because we'll have to finish up in about 5 minutes, because we've got to get ready for a Q&A in about half an hour. I think that COVID-19 is something I'd like to discuss, actually. I don't know if you'd like to join us again for an open session, Douglas, but I think it's one thing I'd actually like to discuss more in the future, actually, in the next session. So the final comment from Sean is, so a promiscuous woman actually benefits from promiscuity. In that contested paternity scenario, having more men around might be the father gives her a wider range of choices, so she could finger the guy who thinks she is most likely to cooperate. Yes, so he's suggesting there that because the men can't establish paternity reliably, that she could point the finger at somebody, the man who's most likely to essentially comply.
In actual fact, what she's likely to do is marry the guy that's got the most money. And then just go and screw whoever she likes after that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
Natalie, you didn't get to talk on that issue. Did you got anything to say?
So I'm in 2 minds about it. If we go back to George Christensen's story, where the man found out 10 years later he'd actually fathered this child, it was actually due to a court case going on where there was custody battle.
Right.
This woman pulled out the card and said, it's not your kid. I think when it comes to that, this man has been the child's father for 10 years, and no amount of DNA is going to take away the love and the caring and the heart and everything he's put into this child. It's still, for me, it would still be, he would still see the boy as his child. That's when I can 1% sort of understand the DNA test is going to be irrelevant. This father's still going to want to be part of the child's life. And I think it goes back to the good old days of, well, the good old saying of, it takes more than sperm to be a father. Like,
Yeah.
He can still choose that, though. I mean, if he knows, and there are men who have done that. There are men who have
Yeah.
decided that they've had such connection to the child, they will continue to be, even though they were deceived. There have been men who've chosen that. So we should wrap up because we have to prep ourselves for the next Q&A. So thank you very much, Douglas, for coming in as a guest. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Douglas, if you're interested, we do have a couple of open sessions tomorrow if you're interested in joining us again.
Certainly. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.